Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Tomb of Qin Shi Huang. You're standing in a torch-lit corridor 250 feet beneath the orchards of Shaanxi province, and the year is 210 BCE. Above you, an empire mourns. Below you, workmen are sealing the last of the inner passages, and none of them know yet that they will never walk back out. The first emperor of China, the man who unified 7 warring kingdoms into one nation, is being lowered into a chamber built to outlast his enemies, his rivals, and, if the old records are right, time itself. The final crossbow traps are being armed. The last of the mercury is being poured, and then the doors close, and they do not open again. Not in the Han Dynasty, not in the Tang, not now, over 2,200 years later. The tomb sits inside a burial mound just under 250 feet tall, at the center of a necropolis that historians estimate covers roughly 22 square miles, an area larger than some cities. What most people picture when they hear Qin Shi Huang is the terracotta army, the 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers discovered by farmers digging a well in 1974. But the army isn't the tomb, it's the outer guard. It sits nearly a mile away from the actual burial mound, one ring in a set of defenses designed in concentric layers, army outside, palace replicas inside that, and at the very center, a chamber that has never been opened, entered, or seen by anyone since the doors closed in 210 BCE. Here's what makes this impossible to dismiss as legend. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing around 94 BCE, roughly a century after the emperor's death, described the tomb's interior in disturbingly specific terms. He wrote of a scale model of the emperor's entire empire built into the chamber floor, with rivers and seas rendered in flowing mercury, mechanically pumped to simulate movement, and a ceiling inlaid with pearls to represent the stars. For centuries, historians treated this as poetic exaggeration. Then, in 1981, Chinese geochemists ran soil surveys across the mound and found mercury concentrations up to 100 times higher than the natural background level in the surrounding region, concentrated specifically over the presumed burial chamber and thinning out toward the edges. In the decades since, follow-up surveys using more sensitive equipment have confirmed the same anomaly, and the pattern of concentration roughly traces the outline of ancient China's actual river systems. Modern remote sensing has only deepened the mystery. Gravity and resistivity surveys conducted since the 1990s have mapped an unusually large, apparently intact underground chamber beneath the mound, its structure still holding after more than 2 millennia, with no evidence of the roof having collapsed. Every non-invasive method available, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic sounding, mercury vapor detection, has pointed toward the same conclusion. There is something enormous and undisturbed, sitting exactly where Sima Qian said it would be. And yet, nobody has gone in. The official explanation from Chinese archaeological authorities is preservation. When the terracotta army was first excavated, the painted lacquer finish on the clay soldiers began flaking and fading within minutes of exposure to open air, the pigments oxidizing faster than conservators could stabilize them. Officials point to this as a cautionary tale, arguing that whatever lies inside the sealed chamber, silk banners, painted surfaces, organic material preserved for 2,000 years, would be destroyed the moment modern air reached it. Better, they argue, to wait for future technology capable of a fully non-invasive excavation than to open a door that can never be closed again. But that explanation strains under its own weight. China has the resources, the funding, and the technological ambition to attempt a controlled, low-oxygen excavation using techniques that didn't exist even 20 years ago: fiber optic microcameras, robotic sampling arms, sealed nitrogen environments. Other sites, with equally fragile organic material, sealed for equally long, have been opened using exactly these precautions. The mercury readings alone would make any modern excavation team pause, since mercury vapor at the concentrations recorded would be lethal in an enclosed space without heavy protective measures. Some researchers have quietly floated the idea that the preservation rationale is not the whole story, that the risk assessment behind keeping the tomb sealed weighs political and cultural symbolism as heavily as it weighs conservation science. The first emperor is not just an archaeological subject in China. He is a founding national myth. Opening his tomb means opening a myth to modern scrutiny, and myths do not always survive that kind of light. So the questions remain exactly where Sima Qian left them, over 2,000 years ago. Why does the mercury pattern match an ancient river map so precisely if the story is only legend? What does an intact chamber under a quarter-mile of packed earth actually contain if remote sensing keeps confirming that something is down there, untouched? And if the technology to look exists right now, what is actually being protected by refusing to use it? This is not the only chamber on Earth that's been confirmed, in detail, from the outside, by hard science, and then left completely untouched. 900 miles west, inside the most famous building on the planet, physicists watched subatomic particles fall through solid limestone for months and found a room the size of a passenger jet that no living person has ever set foot in. Number 2. The Great Pyramid's Big Void. You're sitting in a cramped control room outside the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it's late 2016. Rows of monitors track data streaming in from detector plates hidden inside the monument, plates that have spent months doing nothing more dramatic than counting muons, subatomic particles raining down from the upper atmosphere at a steady, predictable rate. Stone blocks them. Empty space lets them through in slightly greater numbers. It's a simple physics trick, the same principle used to scan volcanoes and shipping containers, repurposed here to see inside 4,500 years of solid limestone without moving a single block. And then, on one screen, a shape starts to resolve where nothing should be, a shadow of empty space sitting directly above the Grand Gallery, roughly 100 feet long. Nobody in the room says anything for a long moment, then someone reaches for the phone. This is the discovery that would be published the following year as the Big Void, the largest unknown internal structure found inside the Great Pyramid since the interior passages were first mapped by explorers in the 19th century. The project, called Scan Pyramids, was an international collaboration between Egyptian antiquities authorities, French and Japanese research institutions, and university physics departments, using 3 independent detection methods: muon emulsion plates, scintillator, hodoscopes, and gas detectors, specifically so that no single technology's flaw could produce a false result. All 3 confirmed the same void, in the same location, at the same scale. Here's what makes this impossible to shrug off as a rounding error. The void's estimated dimensions are comparable to the length of a commercial passenger jet, and it sits parallel to the famous Grand Gallery, one of the most studied passages in the entire pyramid, at a scale simply too large to be an accident of construction technique. The 2017 findings were published in the peer-reviewed journal Nature, subjected to the same scrutiny as any major physics result, and independently confirmed by all 3 detection methods used. This isn't fringe speculation measured with questionable equipment. It's mainstream, published, peer-reviewed science confirming that a room-sized space exists inside the most studied ancient monument on Earth, and that no human being, ancient or modern, has left any confirmed trace of ever setting foot inside it. Competing theories emerged almost immediately. Some Egyptologists proposed the void is simply a relieving chamber, a construction gap built to redistribute weight above the Grand Gallery's ceiling, similar to smaller relieving chambers already known to exist elsewhere in the pyramid, the largest of which measures only a few feet in height and has been fully surveyed for well over a century. Others pointed out that known relieving chambers are a fraction of this size, and that a 100-foot void positioned this precisely looks less like a structural afterthought and more like a deliberately built space. A small endoscopic camera inserted through an existing crack in 2018 confirmed the void's existence, but couldn't reach far enough to reveal its full contents, and the survey stalled there. The camera transmitted a handful of frames, grainy, inconclusive, before the cable reached its limit and the team pulled it back out. Nobody has seen past those few feet since. The mystery didn't stay contained to one void. In March 2023, a follow-up Scan Pyramids scan using ground-penetrating radar and an ultrasonic probe identified a separate corridor-like structure roughly 30 feet long behind the chevron-shaped blocks on the pyramid's north face, close to the original entrance. It, too, has never been physically entered. 2 confirmed, undocumented internal spaces, found 6 years apart, using different technology, in the single most examined building on the planet. The official response from Egyptian antiquities authorities since the 2018 endoscope attempt has stayed the same, measured and slow. Officials maintain that any further investigation must be non-invasive, that no new holes will be drilled into the pyramid, and that additional scanning technology is still being evaluated years after both discoveries. That's a defensible position on its face. The Great Pyramid is one of the last wonders of the ancient world still standing. But years have now passed since a peer-reviewed physics team confirmed a jet-sized void sitting inside the most famous building on the planet, and no further public findings have emerged. Independent researchers have noted that far smaller, far less significant discoveries elsewhere in Egyptian archaeology have moved from confirmation to controlled excavation in a fraction of the time this void has sat publicly known and physically unreached. If the caution were purely about preserving the pyramid's structural integrity, non-invasive robotic exploration through the existing crack, already attempted once in 2018, would be the obvious next step, not a multi-year pause. The unresolved questions here aren't speculative flourishes, they're the direct, published conclusion of physicists who found something and then watched the investigation stall. What does a 100-foot void positioned precisely above the Grand Gallery actually contain if it's too large to be an ordinary construction gap? Why has a discovery confirmed by 3 independent detection methods and published in Nature not produced a single follow-up finding in the years since? And if the concern is truly just preservation, why has the least invasive method available, the same microcamera approach already tested once, not been deployed again? Some sealed spaces are a mystery because no living person has the tools to reach them. Others are a mystery for the opposite reason, because the people who built them had every tool they needed and chose, on purpose, to put them out of reach forever. Number 3. Gobekli Tepe. You're crouched inside a ring of towering limestone pillars on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and it's roughly 8000 BCE. The stone in front of you stands nearly 18 feet tall and weighs as much as 10 tons, carved with the coiled body of a snake and the folded wings of a vulture. And you and your people did not build this with metal tools, because metal tools do not exist yet. Agriculture barely exists yet. Pottery does not exist yet. And yet here you are, about to do something that will make no sense to anyone who finds this place thousands of years from now. You are burying it. Not because it collapsed, not because an enemy destroyed it. You and your people are deliberately filling this temple, the one your ancestors built and used and gathered inside for generations, with rubble and broken tools and animal bone, until the towering stones vanish completely under the ground. And once it's buried, no one will come back to unbury it, ever again. Gobekli Tepe was first flagged as unusual in a 1963 joint survey by the University of Chicago and Istanbul University, but it was dismissed at the time as an unremarkable medieval cemetery. It wasn't until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating the site in 1995, working under the German Archaeological Institute, that the true scale of what was buried there became clear. Radiocarbon dating, cross-checked across multiple samples from the same fill layers, places the oldest enclosures at roughly 9600 BCE, making the site older than Stonehenge by approximately 6,000 years, and older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by roughly 7,000 years. It was built by hunter-gatherers, before the archaeological record shows any evidence of settled agriculture in the region, which directly contradicts the long-standing assumption that farming had to come first, that only settled, food-surplus societies could organize the labor to raise monumental architecture. Gobekli Tepe suggests the opposite order entirely, that people gathered to build something sacred first, and agriculture followed. Here's what makes this impossible to file away as an ordinary ruin. Every one of the massive, circular enclosures excavated at Gobekli Tepe was found packed with a deliberate fill of rubble, broken flint tools, and animal bones, not wind-blown sediment or natural erosion, which geologists can distinguish easily by how the material settles. This was intentional backfilling, carried out by the same culture that built the enclosures, and it happened repeatedly, with new enclosures raised nearby and later buried in turn, in a cycle that seems to have continued for well over 1,000 years. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys conducted since 2003 indicate the hill contains at least 20 more enclosures beyond the ones already excavated, spread across a mound roughly 22 acres wide, and by most published estimates, less than 10% of the entire site has ever been dug up and seen by human eyes since it was reburied. Schmidt's own working theory, and the one still most widely cited was that each enclosure had a functional lifespan, that it was used for a set period, ritually decommissioned, and sealed the way you'd close a chapter, with a new one built nearby to replace it. It's a reasonable, evidence-consistent explanation, and it fits the layered pattern of enclosure after enclosure found stacked across the centuries, one generation's temple becoming the next generation's foundation. But it doesn't explain why a hunter-gatherer society, with no writing, no permanent settlements, and no evidence of centralized leadership, found the ability to organize the labor of quarrying, transporting, and raising 10-ton stones, not once, but repeatedly, only to bury each achievement on purpose rather than build on top of it or maintain it indefinitely. Structures this monumental almost always signal accumulating power, a ruling class consolidating its authority through permanent architecture. Gobekli Tepe shows the opposite instinct: immense effort spent, then immense effort spent again to put it back in the ground. And with more than 90% of the hill still unexcavated, no one actually knows if the pattern holds all the way down, or if something entirely different sits in the enclosures nobody has reached yet. The questions this leaves aren't small ones. Why would a society with no permanent villages organize the manpower to build monumental temples at all, thousands of years before anyone thought that was possible? Why bury each one instead of simply abandoning it to time and weather? And with the vast majority of the hill still sealed under earth, its own builders piled on top of it, what happens the day archaeologists finally reach whatever sits at the bottom of that pattern? A temple can be buried on purpose, by the very hands that built it, patiently over generations. A library can be buried by accident, in a single afternoon, by a mountain nobody realized was a volcano until it was too late to run. Number 4. The Villa of the Papyri. You're a household slave in a wealthy Roman villa on the Bay of Naples, and it's the afternoon of August 24th, 79 CE. Your master's library, hundreds of papyrus scrolls racked floor to ceiling in a room built specifically to hold them, sits one floor below where you're standing. The mountain across the bay has been rumbling for hours, and ash is starting to fall like gray snow. Nobody in this house believes yet that Vesuvius is a volcano, because nobody here has ever seen one erupt. By tomorrow morning, a pyroclastic surge, moving faster than a person can run, will bury this entire villa under more than 60 feet of volcanic material, so fast and so completely that the scrolls in that library won't burn to ash. They'll be carbonized instead, sealed solid, intact, and completely unreadable, for longer than the Roman Empire itself will survive. The Villa of the Papyri was discovered by accident in the 1750s, when workers digging a well for the Bourbon king, Charles III, struck marble flooring nearly 90 feet underground. Engineer Carl Weber spent years tunneling through solidified volcanic rock to map the villa blind, by lamplight, without ever opening it to open air. And in one room, his crew found more than 1,800 carbonized papyrus scrolls, the only intact library to survive anywhere from the classical world. Modern open-air excavation of Herculaneum only began in earnest in 1927, and a fresh push to re-excavate the villa itself in the 1990s uncovered a further section before funding and structural concerns stopped the work again. Large sections of the villa, quite possibly a second floor, and quite possibly more of the property entirely, remain buried and unexcavated to this day, sitting directly beneath the modern town of Ercolano. Here's what makes this more than an ordinary buried ruin. The scrolls recovered in the 18th century were almost entirely Greek philosophical texts, many by the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus. A villa of this scale and wealth, scholars have pointed out for decades, would typically have held a matching Latin library alongside the Greek one, arranged in a separate room the way educated Roman households commonly organize their books. That second library, if it exists, has never been found. Classicists, including researchers connected to the Herculaneum Society at Oxford, have argued it likely sits on a lower level of the villa that Weber's 18th century tunnels never fully reached, and that formal 20th century excavation never got back down to before work paused again. The scrolls that were recovered sat in museum storage for more than 260 years as solid, blackened cylinders, too fragile to unroll by hand without destroying them completely. Attempts throughout the 19th and 20th centuries physically damaged or destroyed dozens of scrolls in the process of trying. It wasn't until 2023, when a crowdsourced research competition called the Vesuvius Challenge applied CT scanning and machine learning to virtually unwrap the scrolls without physically touching them. That researchers read confirmed words from inside a sealed scroll for the first time in the object's entire recorded history. Full passages followed in 2024. The scrolls had been sitting in institutional collections, fully accounted for, completely unread, for longer than the United States has existed as a country. The official position from Italian heritage authorities is that further excavation of the villa's lower levels is a matter of resources and structural risk, not concealment. Ercolano is a living town built directly above the site, and excavating deeper would mean disturbing modern foundations, a real and expensive engineering problem, not a cover-up. But the resource argument doesn't explain why, even with a specific, scholarly predicted location for a second library and repeated formal proposals to resume digging, funding for the project has been allowed to lapse again and again since the 1990s. It doesn't explain why the scrolls, that were already sitting in a museum vault, no excavation required, sat completely unread for 2.5 centuries simply because no one had the technology to look inside them without destroying them. And it raises an uncomfortable possibility for classicists. If the finished, catalogued, already recovered scrolls held secrets for 260 years, what does that suggest about the shelves nobody has ever reached at all? So the questions sit exactly where the ash left them nearly 2,000 years ago. Does a second, Latin-language library really exist on a level of the villa still buried beneath a modern town? What do the thousands of scroll fragments already recovered but still unscanned actually say, now that reading a sealed scroll without opening it is finally possible? And if one afternoon of volcanic ash could seal an entire library so completely that it took 260 years and artificial intelligence to read a single word, what else got sealed alongside it that no one has thought to look for yet? Some places are sealed by a volcano's geology and then kept sealed by the modern town built directly on top of the ash. Others are sealed by nothing but water, and 100 years spent without the equipment needed to get past it. Number 5. The Tombs of Nuri. You're a priest standing on the west bank of the Nile at Nuri in the Kingdom of Kush, and it's roughly 310 BCE. King Nastasin's funeral procession has reached the base of his pyramid, smaller and steeper than the pyramids of Egypt to the north, built for a kingdom that ruled the Nile for centuries after Egypt's own pharaohs had faded from power. The burial chamber has been cut deep beneath the pyramid, well below ground level, and as the last offerings are carried down the entrance stairway, no one here has any reason to think water will ever be a problem. The Nile is a comfortable distance away, and always has been. You seal the chamber the way your predecessors sealed the kings before him, confident it will stay dry, undisturbed, and closed exactly as you left it. 22 centuries later, it will still be closed. It will simply be underwater instead. Nuri sits on the Nile in what is now Sudan, the primary royal burial ground of the Kingdom of Kush from roughly the 7th century BCE onward, holding the pyramids of more than 20 Kushite kings and queens, including Taharka, the Kushite pharaoh who ruled Egypt itself during the 25th dynasty. American Egyptologist George Reisner surveyed and partially excavated the site in the early 20th century, mapping dozens of funerary monuments. Even then, his own field notes recorded a growing problem. Several of the underground burial chambers were already flooded with groundwater, too dangerous and too poorly understood to fully excavate with the tools of his era. He left them exactly as he found them, sealed, submerged, and unexplored. Here's what makes this more than an old excavation gap. Rising groundwater along this stretch of the Nile, driven by decades of dam construction, irrigation expansion, and shifting river hydrology, has only gotten worse since Reisner's time. Today, at least 4 Kushite royal burial chambers at Nuri remain completely unexcavated, submerged under standing water that has occupied the passages and chambers for generations. Nobody, not Reisner's team, not the Sudanese antiquities authorities who inherited the site, not any archaeologist in the century since, has ever walked into these specific chambers, because for most of that century there was no way to do so without drowning. That changed only recently. In 2018, the Nuri Archaeological Expedition, directed by American archaeologist Pierce Paul Kriesman and supported by the American Research Center in Egypt, began the first attempt at underwater archaeology ever conducted in Sudan, sending trained divers down through flooded shafts and into the submerged burial chamber of King Nastasen, the same king sealed into the ground at Nuri roughly 23 centuries ago. It marked the first time any human being is known to have entered that specific chamber since the day it was closed. The straightforward explanation for why these tombs sat unexplored for so long is simply practical difficulty, not concealment. Underwater excavation is slow, expensive, and dangerous, requiring specialized training most archaeological teams never need. Sudan's own political instability and limited excavation funding, compared to neighboring Egypt's much larger tourism economy, meant Nuri never received the sustained international attention or resources that flowed toward Giza or the Valley of the Kings. But funding and technique don't fully explain why, even now, only one of the 4 known flooded chambers has been attempted, or why decades passed between Reisner first documenting the flooding in the early 1900s and anyone returning with the equipment to actually go inside. Kushite Nuri sits in the shadow of Egyptian archaeology in almost every sense, understudied, underfunded, and now, quite literally, underwater, even though its kings once ruled Egypt itself. Sudan's ongoing civil conflict has repeatedly interrupted the Nuri expedition's work since 2023, leaving the remaining 3 flooded chambers exactly as inaccessible as they were when Reisner first noted them more than a century ago. The questions Nuri leaves behind are practical and historical at once. What do the 3 still unexplored flooded chambers contain if Nastasen's own submerged tomb, only reachable by diver, held funerary material still in place after more than 2,000 years? Why has a civilization that ruled the Nile Valley for centuries, producing pharaohs who conquered Egypt itself, received a fraction of the excavation attention its own former subjects have? And what does it say that the only thing separating these tombs from a millennium of silence and the modern era of discovery was a team finally willing to put on diving equipment and go down into the dark? Water can seal a place as completely as any door, simply by making it physically impossible to enter without modern equipment. Half a world away, another set of ancient builders sealed their most sacred passages a different way entirely, by making them too narrow for anyone larger than a machine to ever follow. Number 6. Chavin de Huantar. You're a stonemason in the highlands of Peru, and it's roughly 900 BCE. You've spent months on a passage, so narrow your shoulders. Scrape both walls as you carry the last basket of fill stone inside it. The gallery you're sealing sits beneath the temple platform your people have spent generations building, a maze of interlocking stone corridors, ventilation shafts, and drainage channels cut through solid rock and covered over with megalithic roofing slabs. You built this passage barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl through on purpose. Once the fill is packed in behind you and you back out the way you came, no one, not even the priests who commissioned it, will ever fit through it again. 3,000 years from now, the only thing that will ever make it past this point is a machine. Chavin de Huantar sits high in Peru's Ancash region, the ceremonial center of the Chavin culture, which flourished from roughly 900 to 200 BCE, and gave its name to an entire era of early Andean civilization. UNESCO inscribed it as a World Heritage Site in 1985. Above ground, the temple platforms are impressive but modest. Below ground is where Chavin becomes strange. Archaeologists have documented a labyrinth of interlocking stone galleries threading through and beneath the temple, corridors with names like the Gallery of the Offerings, the Gallery of the Bats, and the Gallery of the Madman, some built to channel river water through the structure to produce a roaring sound during ceremonies. Others, apparently designed to carry and distort the sound of shell trumpets called pututus. At the center of one gallery stands the lanzon, a 15-foot carved stone blade-shaped idol still standing exactly where it was placed thousands of years ago. Here's what makes this more than a fully mapped ruin. In 2019, a research team from Stanford's Chavin de Huantar Archaeological Research and Conservation Program, led by archaeologist John Rick, lowered a small robot into a passage too narrow for a person to enter, roughly 15 inches across. The robot's camera found a completely sealed gallery no living person had ever seen, containing a carved stone bowl shaped like a condor's head, undisturbed since it was placed there millennia earlier. Researchers named it the Condor Gallery. It wasn't an isolated find. Follow-up robotic surveys announced in 2022 identified a connected network of roughly 35 separate tunnels and chambers beneath the site, some containing additional offerings, some containing human remains placed face down in the passage floor, deliberately positioned rather than discarded. That's after more than a century of formal excavation at Chavin, beginning with Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello's original surveys in the 1920s. Generations of researchers have walked these galleries, mapped what they could reach, and published extensively on the site. And in 2019, using nothing more advanced than a small camera on wheels, they still found an entire sealed chamber nobody had ever laid eyes on. The straightforward explanation is that the galleries were sealed as part of ordinary ritual practice, closed off once a specific ceremony or offering cycle was complete, the same way Gobekli Tepe's builders half a world away buried their own finished enclosures. Under this view, the passages weren't built to keep people out forever. They were built to end, deliberately, the way a chapter ends. But that doesn't explain why entire sections remain undiscovered after 100 years of dedicated excavation by people who knew exactly what they were looking for and where to look. It doesn't explain why the passages were engineered too narrow for an adult to comfortably pass through even during construction, forcing the builders themselves to work in cramped, deliberate discomfort rather than leaving room to maneuver. And it doesn't explain why, 3,000 years later, professional archaeologists with ground-penetrating radar and decades of institutional knowledge of the site are still sending in robots and still finding rooms. The questions the Condor Gallery left behind are still open. How much of the total gallery network under Chavin remains completely undocumented, if new sections are still surfacing a full century into serious excavation? Why build ceremonial passages too narrow for the priests, who use them to move through comfortably, rather than simply building them larger? And if the sealing really was routine ritual practice, why does each newly opened gallery still contain offerings placed with obvious care, as if someone expected them to stay hidden rather than simply forgotten? A tunnel network can stay sealed for the simple reason that it was built too narrow for anyone to ever follow. A pyramid passage can stay sealed for the opposite reason, blocked by granite cut, so precisely that brute force was never going to be the answer. Number 7. The Bent Pyramid. You're a mason working the quarry crews at Dashur, and it's roughly 2600 BCE. The pyramid rising above you has already changed shape once, its slope suddenly shallowing partway up after cracks appeared in the structure below. A correction so visible, it will earn this monument the name future generations use for it, the Bent Pyramid. Tonight your job isn't building upward, it's sealing downward. A block of red granite, cut and polished to a tolerance that will still impress engineers 4,000 years from now, is being lowered on ropes into the descending passage. It slides into its groove with barely a hand's width of clearance, and it will not move again for a very long time. Behind you, the workers already know the passage they're closing leads to something the crew was never allowed to see finished. The Bent Pyramid, along with its neighbor the Red Pyramid, was built under the 4th dynasty pharaoh Sneferu, father of Khufu, whose Great Pyramid at Giza would rise a generation later. What makes these two pyramids strange isn't just the visible bend in one of them. It's what their builders did underground. Both structures contain multiple internal chambers, connected by passages deliberately built with false turns, blind corridors, and portcullis blocking systems. Massive stone slabs designed to slide down grooves, cut into the passage walls, and permanently seal a corridor from the inside, with no mechanism to reopen it from the outside. This wasn't decoration. It was a one-way door, engineered specifically so that once something passed through it, it could not be reversed, and no record survives of anyone ever passing through it again. Here's what makes this impossible to fully explain. Modern muon tomography, a technique that uses naturally occurring cosmic ray particles to see through solid stone the same way an X-ray sees through skin, was deployed at nearby Giza starting in 2015 under an international collaboration called Scan Pyramids. When researchers ran similar density mapping techniques across the Dashur pyramids, they confirmed the presence of internal voids and passage sections that don't match any published excavation record, spaces whose exact dimensions and contents remain unknown because nobody has physically reached them. The granite portcullis blocks that seal these sections were engineered with a precision, corners squared, surfaces polished flat to within fractions of an inch, that required tools and techniques Egyptologists still debate the full details of, more than a century after the passages were first surveyed from the outside. The Bent Pyramid was the first monument the Scan Pyramids project targeted when the survey began in 2015, using muon detector plates and infrared thermography positioned around its base for months at a time to rule out statistical noise before announcing anything publicly. By 2019, that data had confirmed additional low-density anomalies behind the pyramid's western face, distinct from the known internal chambers, roughly consistent in shape with further undocumented passages. It has never been physically reached. Egyptian antiquities authorities have restricted deeper access to several of these inner sections for decades, citing structural instability. The passages are narrow. The supporting stone has shifted over 4,500 years, and sending researchers or equipment through a passage that could collapse risks lives and risks damaging one of the oldest standing structures on Earth. It's a reasonable-sounding caution, and no one disputes that these pyramids have genuine structural stress, visible in the very bend that gives one of them its name. But the explanation gets harder to accept once you look at what has actually been opened elsewhere in the same complex. Sections of the Red Pyramid with comparable stress fractures and comparable age have been surveyed and entered by researchers using modern shoring techniques, while the specific sealed portcullis sections in the Bent Pyramid remain officially off-limits with no public timeline for further study. Instead, restriction clusters suspiciously around the sections that were most deliberately sealed by the original builders, the ones with the granite blocks lowered into place on purpose, rather than the sections that simply degraded naturally over time. Researchers who've pushed for access describe a pattern of delay. Permit applications stalled for years, survey requests approved for scanning but denied for physical entry. That looks less like caution and more like avoidance, which leaves the same unresolved questions Egyptologists have quietly argued over for decades. If these blocked passages only contain empty construction space, why go to the trouble of sealing them with load-bearing granite plugs cut to impossible tolerances, rather than simply leaving them open the way ordinary construction gaps were left elsewhere in the same pyramid? Why does structural risk seem to apply more strictly to the sections the ancient builders themselves chose to close forever, and not to the newly detected anomaly the scanning team has yet to touch at all? And what, precisely, were Sneferu's engineers protecting when they made absolutely sure that whatever sat beyond that granite block would never be seen again by anyone who hadn't already been trusted to build it? Stone can be sealed by masons working in daylight, with granite blocks heavy enough to need no further protection. On the far side of the world, a much more recent authority reached for a different kind of seal entirely, a single word of refusal, repeated for well over a century. Number 8. Daisen Kofun. You're a local government official named Kashiwagi Masanori, and it's 1872, in Sakai, Japan, in the days after a violent typhoon. Word has reached your office that the storm has torn open the front slope of the largest burial mound in the country, a mound so old that by your own era, nobody can say with certainty who is buried inside it. You arrive to find a landslide has exposed a stone-lined chamber near the base, and inside it, a chest-shaped stone coffin, undisturbed for roughly 14 centuries, surrounded by swords, armor, and glass vessels. You sketch what you see as carefully as you can, by hand, knowing this may be the only record anyone ever makes of it. Within days, on orders from above, the chamber is sealed again, and the artifacts are returned to the earth. Your drawings will still be the most direct evidence anyone has of what's inside Daisen Kofun more than 150 years later. Daisen Kofun, also called Daisen Ryo, is the largest kofun, or keyhole-shaped burial mound, in Japan, and among the largest tombs by footprint anywhere on Earth, its base covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza, even though it stands far lower. It measures nearly 1,600 feet from end to end, ringed by a moat system with a combined perimeter approaching 2 miles. It sits at the center of the Mozu Furuichi Kofun Group, which UNESCO inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2019. Traditional Japanese court histories, the Nihon Shoki and Kojiki, attribute the tomb to Emperor Nintoku, a ruler said to have reigned in the 4th century. Archaeological dating of the mound's construction points instead to the mid to late 5th century, a gap of decades that historians have never fully reconciled. Here's what makes this more than an old royal grave. Every Kofun identified as an imperial tomb, Daisen included, falls under the authority of Japan's Imperial Household Agency, which classifies the sites as sacred and has maintained an effective ban on archaeological excavation of the central burial chambers ever since the 1872 landslide briefly accidentally exposed one. Kashiwagi's sketches and the written account of a local priest, Furukawa Kyuko, remain the only first-hand documentation of the tomb's interior in existence, unverified by any modern archaeological method, drawn from a chamber that was resealed within days and has not been reopened, by accident or otherwise, in the century and a half since. The identity of the person actually buried inside has never been confirmed by physical evidence. The attribution to Nintoku still rests entirely on court tradition, not on anything archaeologists have been allowed to independently verify. In February 2018, for the first time since before the Second World War, the Imperial Household Agency permitted a small, tightly supervised group, representatives from 16 Japanese archaeological and historical associations, to walk a restricted portion of the mound's lower terrace under official escort. It was widely reported as a landmark moment in Japanese archaeology. It was also, notably, nowhere near the 1872 chamber. No soil was moved, no artifact was recovered. In 2025, a private art dealer's collection yielded a ceremonial iron knife and fragments of gilded armor that Kokugakuin University Museum subsequently authenticated as genuine Daisen Kofun grave goods, the first individual objects from the tomb ever formally confirmed, more than 150 years after Kashiwagi first sketched similar items and watched them get buried again. The official explanation is respect for religious and imperial tradition, and it's not an unreasonable one on its face. Many cultures maintain restricted access to active sites of ancestor veneration, and Japan's imperial institution has continuously occupied a unique, unbroken position in national life for longer than almost any other monarchy on earth. But that explanation sits uneasily against what historians actually need the tomb to answer. The 5th century is one of the murkiest periods in Japanese history, the era in which the Yamato court consolidated power and Japan's relationship with the Korean peninsula took shape in ways still debated today. A single accidental landslide in 1872 revealed more about the tomb's contents than a century and a half of formal, deliberate archaeology has been permitted to confirm since. Some historians have quietly suggested the agency may have reasons beyond religious sentiment to leave the mid-5th century dating gap unexamined. The Imperial Household Agency has never engaged publicly with that suggestion. It has simply maintained the restriction, without exception, for generations. The questions Daisen Kofun leaves behind are the same ones raised by Kashiwagi's own sketches, and by every Japanese archaeologist who has cited them since, without ever being allowed to confirm what they show. Is the tomb actually Nintoku's? Or does the dating gap mean it belongs to someone else, someone history may have simply misfiled for over 1,000 years? What else sits in that chamber beyond what a frightened local official had time to draw before being ordered to bury it again? And in a nation with the resources and expertise to excavate carefully and respectfully, what does it mean that the closest anyone has come to an answer was an accident of weather a century and a half ago, never repeated on purpose since? From a grave briefly, accidentally opened once, and then sealed again by decree, we travel to an entire buried city, kept sealed by conservation policy, half of it deliberately left in the ground for reasons that have nothing to do with what might still be down there. Number 9. Mohenjo-daro. You're an archaeologist working under Sir John Marshall's excavation crew in the Sindh region of what is now Pakistan, and it's 1925. You've spent weeks clearing dust from a raised mound at the western edge of the site, a section clearly elevated and walled off from the rest of the sprawling city below, and you already suspect this was the part of Mohenjo-daro ordinary residents never entered even in its own time, 5,000 years ago. Then, your trowel hits something that makes the crew pause. A patch of fused, glassy material, blackened and partially melted, sitting near the citadel's foundation, in a civilization that left behind no fortification walls, no mass weapon caches, no obvious evidence of warfare anywhere else in the city. It could be nothing more than an overheated kiln or a workshop fire, the kind of localized scorching found at plenty of Bronze Age sites. But nobody on the crew can say that for certain either. not from a single afternoon's digging. And decades later, a decision will be made that guarantees most of the city around you will never be dug up at all. Kiln, foundation, and every other unanswered patch of ground along with it. To be clear about what's actually accessible today, the excavated portion of Mohenjo-daro is a real, walkable UNESCO World Heritage Site, open to visitors, its streets, granary, and great bath fully exposed and studied since Marshall's original digs. That part of the story isn't a mystery. What this is about is everything that excavation never touched, and by most professional estimates, that's the majority of the ancient city, including large sections of the citadel mound itself, all of it still buried, unseen by anyone, since the city was abandoned roughly 3,800 years ago. Mohenjo-daro was one of the largest urban centers of the Indus Valley Civilization, a sophisticated Bronze Age culture that built grid-planned streets, standardized brick sizing, and one of the ancient world's most advanced sanitation systems, all without, as far as archaeologists can tell, a centralized king, a monumental palace, or the kind of visible warfare architecture common to contemporary civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The city's western mound, the citadel, was deliberately elevated on an artificial platform and physically separated from the lower residential city by walls, suggesting a restricted zone even within its own functioning society, one that ordinary inhabitants of Mohenjo-daro likely never had cause or permission to enter, thousands of years before any modern authority added a second layer of restriction on top of it. Here's what makes the buried majority more than an ordinary funding gap. Since Marshall's original 1920s excavation seasons, researchers working at the site have documented small patches of vitrified material, fused clay and stone, at scattered points across the ruins, most often sited in and around the citadel structure. Most archaeologists treat this as a minor, plausibly mundane detail, likely kiln overfiring or a contained structural fire, and it has never been the subject of a dedicated modern chemical study confirming a cause either way. Following decades of excavation from the 1920s through the 1960s, Pakistani and UNESCO-affiliated conservation authorities made the deliberate decision to halt further large-scale digging at the site entirely, a policy still in place today. The reasoning was groundwater salinity, rising moisture, wicking mineral salts, up through the ancient brickwork and crumbling it, and every previously excavated section exposed to open air has visibly deteriorated faster than conservators can stabilize it. As a direct result, researchers estimate that well over half of the ancient city's total footprint, including most of the citadel's original restricted zone, remains completely unexcavated, unseen, and unstudied to this day. The official position, backed by real and ongoing conservation science, is that further excavation would do more harm than good, that the priority must be preserving what's already exposed, rather than uncovering more of a city that modern conservation techniques still can't adequately protect once it's pulled out of the ground. That's defensible, and UNESCO's continued involvement reflects a genuine, well-documented preservation crisis, not an invented excuse. But the salinity argument doesn't explain why the citadel was walled off from the rest of the population in the first place, thousands of years before any modern conservation policy added a second layer of restriction on top of it. Mohenjo-daro shows remarkably little evidence of the rigid hierarchy or palace architecture that usually explains a restricted zone in Bronze Age cities elsewhere. And the fact that most of the city, including most of the citadel's original restricted area, sits directly beneath the ground, unexamined, means whatever justified that ancient separation may simply still be down there, waiting, for reasons nobody excavating the visible 10% has ever had to answer. The questions Mohenjo-daro leaves behind are the same ones its own excavators were asking a century ago. Why was the citadel walled off from the rest of the population in the first place, in a society that otherwise shows remarkably little evidence of rigid hierarchy or a ruling class? What would a modern chemical analysis of that scorched patch near the foundation actually show, if anyone ever ran one? And with more than half the city still unexcavated by deliberate policy, how much of the answer is simply still buried, a few feet down, underground, nobody has been allowed to dig? One buried city closes this chapter of the pattern. From half a world away, we travel to the very last chamber on this list, one that actually was entered, once, deliberately, by trained excavators, before almost everything they learned about it was lost to a war nobody saw coming. Number 10. The Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni. You're a construction worker in Paola, Malta, and it's 1902. Your crew is cutting a cistern into the bedrock for a new housing development when the floor beneath your feet gives way, and instead of hitting solid stone, you fall into open air. Below you is a chamber cut directly out of solid limestone. No metal tools involved. Curved walls carved with a precision that mimics the timber and thatch architecture of above-ground temples, dropping away into a second level, and beneath that, a third, deeper still. Your employer, in one of the more short-sighted decisions in archaeological history, tries to keep the discovery quiet to avoid delaying the housing project above it. It doesn't stay quiet for long. What's beneath your feet turns out to be one of the only known prehistoric underground temple complexes on Earth, and what your crew glimpsed that afternoon is about to become one of the most fragile records in all of archaeology. The Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni was properly investigated starting in 1903 by Maltese archaeologist Manuel Magri, and later continued by Sir Themistocles Zamet after Magri's early death, revealing a subterranean complex cut across 3 descending levels, dated to roughly 4000 to 2500 BCE, making it several centuries older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Zamet's team did reach the deepest level. The chamber archaeologists came to call the Oracle Room, and did recover the remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals, along with carved stone figures, red ochre wall paintings, and architectural details carved from the living rock in imitation of structures that would have originally stood above ground in wood. For a handful of years in the early 20th century, this was one of the most thoroughly examined ancient sites anywhere in the entire Mediterranean basin. Here's what makes the story more complicated than a simple story of discovery and study. Malta endured sustained aerial bombing during the Second World War, and the museum collection housing much of Zamet's original documentation and a significant portion of the recovered skeletal remains suffered serious losses during that period. Some records and materials destroyed outright, others scattered or never fully reconciled with the original excavation notes afterward. The result is that a large percentage of what was actually found in that deepest chamber, the specific positioning of remains, the full context of the artifacts, details modern forensic archaeology could analyze with techniques Zamet's era never had access to, simply isn't fully recoverable anymore. The chamber was seen once, briefly, by early 20th century standards of documentation, and then the record of what was seen was partially lost before modern science ever got a chance at it. In the decades since, Maltese heritage authorities have progressively restricted access to the site far more strictly than almost any other prehistoric monument open to the public anywhere in the world. Heritage Malta currently caps admission at a small fixed number of visitors per time slot, booked months in advance, and permanently bars public access, along with nearly all researcher access, to the lowest of the 3 levels entirely. The official reasoning is preservation. Humidity and carbon dioxide from visitor breathing were measurably degrading the ochre paintings, and the stone itself, after the site was briefly opened to larger tourist numbers in the mid-20th century, a documented conservation crisis that led directly to today's strict visitor cap. That explanation is real and undisputed as far as it goes. Condensation damage to prehistoric pigment is a genuine, well-studied conservation problem at ancient sites worldwide, documented at cave art sites on nearly every continent. But it doesn't explain why, in over a century since the losses of the 1940s, no comprehensive modern resurvey of the deepest chamber, using techniques Zamet never had, ground-penetrating imaging, updated forensic analysis of whatever remains are still accounted for, has ever been fully carried out and published. The chamber that produced the site's strangest, least resolved detail, a measured resonance frequency of roughly 110 Hz in a small carved niche, a frequency acoustic researchers in the 2000s found produces measurable, repeatable effects on human brain activity, sits exactly as inaccessible today as it was the moment the original excavation notes went missing. The questions the Hypogeum leaves behind are the same ones its original excavators quietly carried to their own graves, and the same ones no one since has been allowed back in to answer properly. What actually happened to the bulk of the 7,000 remains recovered from the complex given how much of the original documentation didn't survive the 20th century intact. What was the intended purpose of a chamber engineered, whether by accident or design, to produce a resonance frequency capable of measurably altering human brain activity in a civilization with no written language to explain its own intentions? And why, over a century after that construction crew fell through the cistern floor, does the one chamber most worth re-examining with modern tools remain the one place at Hal Saflieni that almost no one is ever allowed to enter? 10 places, spread across the entire history of human construction, a tomb sealed with rivers of mercury that no living person has ever seen. A void the size of a jet, confirmed by physics and touched only once by a camera that saw almost nothing. A temple its own builders buried on purpose, still mostly underground 11,000 years later. A library buried by a volcano in a single afternoon, its scrolls unread for 260 years until artificial intelligence finally looked inside one without opening it. A set of royal tombs left completely unentered for a century, not by choice, but because they've been sitting underwater the entire time. A tunnel network built too narrow for anyone larger than a machine to ever follow. A pyramid passage plugged with granite cut to impossible tolerances. A royal grave briefly, accidentally opened once by a storm a century and a half ago, then sealed shut again by decree ever since. A buried majority of an ancient metropolis nobody has been allowed to dig, and a chamber seen once, briefly, before the record of what was found there was half destroyed by a war. Across 11,000 years and 4 continents, the pattern repeats itself without needing anyone to plan it that way. The places human beings built with the most care and the most purpose are, again and again, the ones somebody made absolutely sure would stay shut, and stay unknown. If this pulled you in, subscribe for more of these deep dives into the places history tried to close the door on. Drop a like if you made it all the way to number 10, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this from.